Hello and welcome to this video in the series on gender relations and economics. In these videos, I discuss various elements of the interplay between gender and economics. The videos are meant to show some of the many ways in which economic relations are gendered and which gender relations are very much about economics. My name is Alyssa Schneebaum. I'm a native New Yorker who's been living in Vienna, Austria since 2010. I have a bachelor's, a master's, and a PhD in economics. I have a bachelor's degree in women and gender studies and a graduate certificate in advanced feminist theory. I don't think that all those degrees make me uniquely qualified to talk about these issues. On the contrary, real world experience matters a lot more than academic qualifications in many ways. But when giving academic talks, those things certainly help. The topic of today's video is feminist economics. There are several books, papers, academic papers, blog posts, videos about feminist economics. The topic has increasingly gained interest from the general public as well as from academics in the last 2 decades. There's not complete agreement about what feminist economics is. I would say if you ask 10 different people who identify as feminist economists what feminist economics is, you would probably get more than 10 answers to that question. So there's really no authoritative figure to tell us what feminist economics is, which I think is a nice reflection of part of what feminist economics is. It's collective knowledge that we are all contributing to, and feminist economics is really how many different people understand the economy and economic processes. Nevertheless, I've identified 5 or 6 goals of feminist economics that I think can really tell us something about what feminist economics is. I'll tell you these 5 goals, and then throughout the video, I'll highlight these goals again and again. So the first, which I kind of call goal number 0, because in a lot of ways it's been achieved, although as I'll show you, definitely not completely. The first goal, and one of the original goals of feminist economic thinkers, was to include women in economic analyses. This is different than having female economists. There is overlap, of course. If you have more female economists, then you're more likely to include women in economic analyses. I have a whole other video in this series on the gender distribution of economists. This goal is really about having women inside the economic analysis. Goal number 1 is to bring issues that are historically considered women's issues, such as care work and housework, into economic analyses. These are economic issues because how much time you spend doing housework and care work really matters for your economic life. Whether you get pension payments for that work or not matter for your economic life. For a long time, this was just missing in economic analysis, and it was really feminist economists and feminist economics that brought these kinds of issues into economics. The second big goal of feminist economics is to understand the masculine biases within the discipline of economics. So this is when we talk about the methods that economists use, the models in economics, the way economics is taught, so the pedagogy, how publishing in economics happens. These have, as I'll explain to you in more detail later, certain biases that are very masculine connotated. So things that we typically associate with masculinity, which is not necessarily just men, but it's the characteristics that men should have. I'll tell you more about that later. Point number 3 is that feminist economics wants to understand differences in outcomes in an intersectional way. So not just your gender, but also your race, your skin color, your ethnic background, the ability of your body, your age, all of the different components of our identity that matter for who we are also matter in how we experience the economy. Point number 4 is moving also beyond the what are the differences. Even if feminist economics takes us more into a more intersectional understanding of differences, there's a tendency in economics or in mainstream economics to say this is the difference, period. The gender wage gap is 20%, period. And feminist economics really helps us move from just the what is the difference to why is that difference there, by building in an understanding of social and political processes and historical processes. Finally, point number 5 is that feminist economics certainly has a more normative flavor than mainstream economics. Normative, where feminist economics will say this is how things ought to be, right? Feminist economics are somewhat different than mainstream economics, in that feminist economics definitely sees economics as politicized. It's not what economists say and do is not in a bubble, and we do have goals. We want the world to be better. We want the world to be a more equal place. As I walk through more details of the goals of feminist economics that I've just identified, I'll give you some examples of work that's currently being done in feminist economics to start to make connections about what this is. What is this feminist economics? Towards the end of the video, I'll give you a case study. So I have picked one particular paper. We'll discuss it a little bit in terms of the question, is this feminist economics? And the case study is meant to help us apply the knowledge from this video to see if we can understand particular work as feminist economics or not. So the first point I said is that feminist economics in many ways sort of started as an institutionalized project because women were just missing in economic analyses. I think it's interesting and helpful to go back to even the analysis of classical economists like Edgeworth and Marshall, and so see how they were talking about women. Michelle Pujol did a lot of interesting work on this. She read through much of the classical literature and comb through it to see how classical economists were talking about women. I'll read 3 of the quotations from these authors that she picked out that I think really say a lot about how women were seen and understood in classical economic analyses. When I say classical economics, I mean at around the turn of the century to the 1900s and the first few decades of the 1900s. So Edgeworth, you know Edgeworth from the Edgeworth box, talking about women in the paid labor force, said it would bring, quote, a debacle ultimately ruinous alike to wealth and family life. Alfred Marshall in 1930, talking about women's employment, it, quote, tempts them to neglect their duty of building a true home and investing their efforts in the personal capital of their children's character and abilities. And Jevons in 1904, talking about women's employment, says, the very beasts of the field tend and guard their whelps with instinctive affection. It is only human mothers which shut their infants up alone or systematically neglect to give them nourishment. So in this classical economic literature, Polo really identified the assumptions about women, and a lot of them are centered around they're married, they have children, or they want to be married, they want to have children, and they ought to be housewives, and they have the comparative advantage in that kind of work. So that was, thinking 100 years ago. And as I said, in a lot of ways, many things have changed in standard, mainstream, top economic journals. There are a lot of analyses about women for sure. But there's often not very much analysis of gender. And I think it's important here, this is a feminist cornerstone of analysis, to differentiate between sex and gender. When we talk about in the social sciences about sex, we're talking about biological differences, men and women. What are the reproductive organs of this person like compared to the other person? Those differences are sex. Gender, however, refers to all of the social categories that relate to men as a group, a biological group, and women as a biological group. We often see in economic analyses differences of men and women in economic analysis, and very often that, even though that's also gender, because when people fill out surveys asking them about their income, their wealth, or whatever, and they're asked to say if they're men or women, they themselves are actually giving their gender because it's their own understanding of their identity. But very often in economic analyses, these categories are understood as sex. So you have groups of men and women, and in economic analyses, you see wages, for example, or labor supply of men and women. But you don't see a lot of gender issues. So as an example, Daniel Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize, or the equivalent of a Nobel Prize in economics, has this great book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And while I was reading it, I came across this particular figure, which comes from a paper from 2006, a paper from Bateson and others, on the cues of what being watched enhance cooperation. And what we see in this figure is the following. The authors of the study went into a workplace, as far as I remember, in the UK, and in this workplace kitchen, they had some tea or some coffee to take. It was in the UK, so it was probably tea. And there was a little canister where people were supposed to donate some money every time they took a cup of tea. But that wasn't always happening, and so they did an experiment, and they said, well, what happens if we hung up pictures of either eyes, people's eyes, or instead if we hung up pictures of flowers? And the hypothesis was, if people feel that they're being watched, right, if you have pictures of eyes, that they will give more money. And as you can see in the figure, in the weeks where the pictures were of eyes, the people did indeed give more money. All the weeks where the pictures were of flowers, the people gave less money for their tea. What jumped off the page for me when I looked at this is that the eyes, the human eyes, are very much gendered. Look at the human eyes that get the most money. Those eyes are looking straight at you. They are not expressive, and they don't convey any kind of emotion. They're very straightforward. Those eyes get the most. They also look like they are likely the eyes on a man's face. Look at the human eyes that get the least amount of money. Those are very likely on a feminine face, right? The face is tilted slightly to the side. There's a strand of hair there, of long hair. Even the tilting, the way that the eyes are looking at somebody, is a more feminine way of looking at somebody. Those eyes got the least amount of money. That is an interesting economic outcome. But this gender difference wasn't discussed at all in the original Bateson paper, and it wasn't discussed at all by Kahneman. And that's the kind of ignorance of women in the economy that still exists. In 2019, a very influential and important book by Caroline Criado Perez. The book is called Invisible Women. And the book goes through many interesting examples of how in economic policy, social policy, women are just completely ignored. And that leads to very bad outcomes, particularly for women, because many policies, many decisions are based on a standard of men and how men live their lives, how masculine people live their lives, and that's very detrimental to the health and well-being of women. One way of counteracting that is called gender budgeting. This is the idea that that's very often macroeconomic policies, stimulus packages should be assessed by policymakers in terms of how they will differently affect men and women. I talk quite a bit more about gender budgeting in the video on gender relations and economics and macroeconomics. The final point to make here is that there might be really a better understanding of women and how women experience the economy if there were more female economists. I have a video on the gender of economists and how that matters for economics. But one good example or one good point to be made here is that economics among the social sciences is really into the idea of considering it itself objective, right? It's completely separated from emotions or personal experiences. It's just objective science, right? But the irony is, particularly in economics, it's very likely not true, especially because the group of economists doing economic research is relatively homogeneous. Economics is very much dominated by male economists, and also very much Western white males. When you have a relatively homogeneous group of researchers working on something, then you're less likely to have truly an objective perspective on something. Because if you bring in other people from other groups in the population, they might have different views of things. There's a very nice paper by May and others that look at the opinions on different economic issues of male and female economists in the American Economic Association. And one of the findings is that on some key issues, male and female economists actually see things differently. This is important because that means that one, it's a threat to the economics profession, because if the economics profession says we're completely objective, but then within the profession there are differing opinions about fundamental issues, then the objectivity is not there, because objectivity necessarily means that diverse sets of people, diverse types of people can look at the same phenomenon and see the same thing. And that's not what's happening. And so if you really want to have stronger objectivity, this is a term that I'm taking from Sandra Harding, stronger objectivity would require more diversity in terms of who economists are. Okay, now to the first point of what feminist economics is, or the first characteristic of feminist economics. And this is the point in feminist economics that has gotten, in a lot of ways, the most traction in the media, because it's kind of very obvious, right? This point is that topics typically ascribed to women need to be really considered in economic analyses. So this is things like care work and housework. That work is very valuable. If nobody took care of little babies would die, and then we wouldn't have anybody to go on and be economic agents later on, right? That's the most kind of fundamental way to understand this. But in general, everybody, all of us, we have all received care. We have all profited from somebody taking care of our home, doing our laundry, cooking our meals. Certainly when we were babies and when we were children, and maybe still even now. That work certainly matters for how we can be in the economy, what kind of economic activities we can take on. And in that sense, it really matters for economic activity. So one big issue in feminist economics is, first of all, recognizing that work as work. And second, trying to value that work. And part of the project of trying to come up with some quantitative measure of what this work is worth is, in a way, it's kind of a PR thing to sort of say, look at how valuable this work is, right? I've seen estimates for different countries where, in terms of GDP, this work, even if you value it at a minimum wage per hour, it's still worth about 50% of GDP in some countries. So it's really very economically valuable. Why does this count, or why does this fall under feminist economics? Well, that's kind of obvious, because most of this work is disproportionately done by one gender, right? Namely, women. The work is often unpaid, or when it's paid, it's often underpaid. The COVID case that we are living through right now is a very good example. Essential workers, or as they're called in some countries, system-relevant workers, are very often women, primarily women, mostly paid very little, which actually shows in a lot of ways standard economic theory of something like hazard pay, where if your job brings you into danger, you should be paid more for it. That's not happening at all in COVID. And so economic theory needs to deal with that a little bit better. COVID, at the latest, has shown us how important this work is, and how valuable it is for our lives, but how economically not valued it is. One of the main founding mothers in this field is Nancy Folbray. I've certainly learned a lot from her. She was one of my dissertation advisors, and she has a lot to say. It's also one of the things she talks about a lot is how care is a very interesting good to study, because it's not a standardized good. So you don't have a price for care the way that you have a price for a can of soda, because it's not standardized. Care is very different depending on who's giving it and to whom. And Nancy Fulbright has done a lot of work on that. I get into these issues in some more detail on the video on household economics in this series. Okay, point number 2 in feminist economics, the recognition of biases in mainstream economics. So the biases in mainstream economics were very much first articulated and understood by Julie Nelson, an economist and a philosopher. She did a lot of work on this issue, especially in the 90s and the early 2000s, where mainstream economics comprised fundamentally neoclassical economics. So a lot of her critique was around the idea of rational economic man, which is an important figure in neoclassical economics, you know, the rational, self-interested person who is fundamentally masculine. And so a lot of her work was about that, the masculine bias of models that only considered agents with those characteristics. To help us understand that, Julie Nelson came up with this gender value compass, where we see on one axis a gender, so masculine and feminine, and on the y-axis positive and negative attributes. So this is attributes that are, you know, typically anthropologically ascribed to masculinity and femininity and considered good or bad. The point that Julie Nelson makes here is that standard economic theory, especially neoclassical theory, really took as their central agents, their economic agents, people with the characteristics in the top left quadrant, namely the good masculine agents. These people were strong, they were rational, they were self-interested, right? So they were optimizers. And that's exactly who the people in the models in neoclassical economics were. Julie Nelson and this framework really helped us understand the biases in neoclassical economics. I think it's important to understand, as the mainstream of economics has evolved, this critique has evolved as well. So the mainstream of economics, I would say, is really moving away from neoclassical economics. And I would say that the mainstream of economics now can be classified fundamentally by empiricism. The biases, the masculine biases, are still there, even though the fundamental characteristics of mainstream economics have changed. So if your main characteristic of mainstream economics is econometrics that ignores gender non-binary people who we don't see in data in economic surveys, the same is true of trans people. But what it also means, if economics is very dependent on empiricism, is that our understanding of economic outcomes and how economic resources are distributed are really fundamentally constrained by the ideas of survey makers, right? It's people who make, and organizations who make up economic surveys that ask people about their economic resources. But how those surveys are done, what questions are asked, really influence our ideas of how resources are distributed. For example, some surveys only ask about household income instead of personal income. What we know from a lot of literature is that resources within households aren't distributed evenly or equally. And so you can't take household income and divide it by 2 if there's a couple in the household and say, well, that's personal income, because that's just not the reality of how resources are distributed. This dependence on empirical data, unfortunately, it gives us a narrow view of reality. I work with microdata all the time in my work, and anybody who does knows we're very constrained in the questions that we can ask just because of data availability. And so we run into a lot of biases, and very often feminist issues like the distribution of resources within households, intersectionality in outcomes gets really lost because we can't see it in the data. This is problematic because, as I'm showing you here, you can really see that the share of papers in top economic journals that use quantitative data has really increased over time and has become the standard in economic analyses. Other biases in mainstream economics have to do with, for example, publishing. So publishing, if you're not publishing in these top journals, you don't get to be considered a top economist. But publishing is still very much about networks. You know, there was last year a big conversation where people, especially on Twitter, were talking about the publication process and how much it's very much about giving a seminar at the right universities to the right people who might be the editors of those journals. So you get to hear the comments that the editor would give you before you submit the paper. Professional networks are still very much masculine dominated, and it will be very difficult to change that until the social norms about who does care work, for example, changes, because for as long as norms ascribe childcare to women, it will be harder for women to travel to seminars, for example. Other biases in economics, pedagogy, for example, how economics is even taught. In many, many universities, the introductory classes are big rooms of hundreds of students where, because most professors are men, you have a male professor standing in front of the room telling the students what economics is and how the economy functions, right? And that's a real bias, because as I said before, men and women, male and female economists often do see things differently. So students are learning economics from one point of view. The other thing is this way of teaching economics also has masculine connotations, right? No interaction, no shared knowledge, just one person telling you how it is without any feedback, without any chance to develop ideas together. And finally, the last masculine bias of mainstream economics that feminist economics tries to deal with is the domain of what economics studies. This refers back to point number one, where you want to look at the household, you want to look at care work and unpaid work as core economic activities, and those things are often not brought into mainstream analysis. Okay, the third point in feminist economics is to have an understanding of the distribution of economic outcomes from an intersectional point of view. So the idea of intersectionality, this is a core idea in feminist theory, where you really have to understand each person as not just one category, not just as man or as woman or as black or as white or as rich or as poor, but instead to see the ways that different categories of identity interact with each other to influence the way that we see the world. A white woman experiences the world very differently than a black woman, right? Both women, but if you add in the category of race, then you have very, very different outcomes and very, very different experiences. And that's really the idea of intersectionality. Almost always, that is fundamentally missing in economic analyses. It's also important when we think about intersectionality to differentiate between feminist economics and gender economics, right? Gender economics says the wage gap between men and women, let's say, is 20%, but a more complex understanding says, well, first of all, we need to be intersectional. We need to not just look at men and women, but what's the wage gap between Black men, Black women, white men of different ages, and so on, with thousands of different categories, right? It gets really complex, and that's part of the challenge of being so dependent on empiricism. You often can't get that kind of complexity in the data. So feminist economics would say you can really benefit from other methodologies, like maybe interviewing people or doing case studies or observations of people, like ethnography. So a more feminist economic approach to understanding differences is to first see that complexity in people's identity, see the complexity of identity also over time. People's gender identity changes over time. People's sexual orientation changes over time. So the complexity also has the dimension of time. There's also complexity in economic circumstances that we have to understand, right? People can have different levels of income, which we think means something, but if you take in the dimension also of wealth, then we understand things very differently. What we see, for example, is some people with very high wealth the highest levels of wealth actually have zero income. Why? Because they don't have to work, because they have such high wealth. So to really understand somebody's economic life, you need complex measures of how they're experiencing the economy, right? Well-being, housing, education, how much debt somebody has, which these days, unfortunately, education and debt for many people, especially in the United States, is inseparable. This complexity refers to what's going on at the micro level, so for people, but it also refers to the macro level, so things like GDP, right? Is GDP the best or only measure of an economy's well-being? Feminist economists would say no. And again, I talk more about that in the video on macroeconomics. Point number 4 in what feminist economics is, this is the movement from the what to the why. So beyond going, what is the gender pay gap, to why is the gender pay gap what it is. And this really gets to the point, I think, of the difference between gender economics and feminist economics, peeling off the layers of what are the institutions, what are the norms, what's the historical context behind what differences in economic outcomes are for men and women. This movement from the what to the why, by looking at things like institutions or norms or even psychology, with things that aren't typically or weren't typically considered economics, that has been shifting in many different fields in economics, which is good. It's nice to see that progress in the discipline. But one thing that continues to differentiate feminist economics from more mainstream fields in economics is the methodology that's used for the analysis. So I've seen some papers in top-ranked mainstream journals that have brought in institutional context to try to understand gender pay gaps, for example, and that's great. But one thing that's missing is an opening up of the methodology that's kind of allowed in economic analyses. And feminist economics is more open to different kinds of methods. So for example, when thinking about the gender pay gap, one big contribution that we had already about 20 years ago was this idea that women are less likely to negotiate higher wages. So they're less likely to ask for a raise, they're less likely to ask for a higher starting salary. We know a lot about this from the book Women Don't Ask from Babcock and Lechevre. And the interesting thing about that book is that it really took different methods to understand this. It wasn't just wage regressions, but instead interviews and observation. And that's important to understand processes, to understand what's going on. And this openness of methodology is something that feminist economics is pushing in the mainstream, because we just can't understand processes. We can't understand everything that's happening if we're only looking at wage regressions, for example. Another element of the why, so I'm just sticking with this example of wage gaps because in a lot of ways it's a very palpable example. It's something that we all live day to day in a lot of ways. So one example is the motherhood penalty, right? So women who have children have lower wages than women who don't have children. This is very interesting when you think about the gender aspect of it, so comparing then women and men with children. And there's been some great work done on this. So for example, these 3 figures that I'm showing you come from a recent paper from Clavin and others. And what we see is that even in different institutional settings, in different countries, when a child is born, there's a large motherhood penalty. So as soon as the kid is born, the women earn much less, and that motherhood penalty is persistent over a long period of time. And after the birth of a child, a man earns less or doesn't earn less, depending on the institutional context. But any penalty that a father experiences is in any case not persistent. A final example of the feminist economics push to move from the question of what to the question of how, or the question of why, is the book Power to Choose by Naila Kabir. This is a very interesting book where Kabir looks at the labor market situation of Bangladeshi women who moved to London and considers really the social norms, power hierarchies, historical context of how these women experienced and interacted with the labor market in London. And it's a great example of how we need to really dig deeper and see whole contexts and whole pictures in order to understand things like labor market outcomes. Point number 5 about what is feminist economics, and the last point that I'll make here in this video, is that feminist economics really believes in normativity. Feminist economics really draws on feminism. That's why it's feminist economics, in that it says this is always about well-being. This is always about people having a good life. This is always about people being okay and having opportunities and being safe and having enough food to eat. The point is that the economy and economic structures didn't come from the sky, you know, they're not just given. They are human created and very much influenced by our actions. And the feminist economic push is to say, we economists want to have an economy that does better for everybody, right? We all want to have enough money to eat and to have a place to live and to have a good life, however defined. And just accepting an extremely unequal distribution of resources, or a situation where people are so poor that they don't have enough food to eat, or they don't have a place to sleep, or they have to choose between housing and food, that's not acceptable. And that is just a tenet of feminism, that everybody should have a good life. Everybody should have the opportunity for a good life. Feminist economics brings that normative assertion into economic analyses and says, we're not just here to look at what's happening in the economy, but instead to look at what's happening so that we can change it. We want it to be better. So to summarize this point, it's really that feminist economics is about having an economy that is characterized by fairness, by equality, by respect, and by humanism. There are so many other examples that I could have given about how to understand feminist economics, work that's being done in feminist economics. Here I'm just listing a few things that come to mind, but at the core of it, the question is, how can we understand economic processes and economic relations and outcomes from a feminist point of view? And that is ultimately what feminist economics is. Finally, I want to talk briefly about a case study that we can use to apply to help understand, to see if we get what feminist economics is and how to understand feminist economics, and to ask ourselves, is a paper that we're reading or is a book that we're reading feminist economics? This is a paper that I'm writing. It's called Partnership Recognition Rights and the Household Division of Labor. And in this paper, I look at how changes to the laws regarding the recognition of same-sex couple partnerships has changed the division of labor within same-sex couples. So when I talk about the division of labor, I mean how much paid work one person does and how much unpaid work the other person does. Typically in different sex couples, what we see is that men do about 2/3 of the paid work and women do about 2/3 of the unpaid work. And the very interesting thing is, in same-sex couples, even though there's no biological difference, right? There's not a man and a woman, but instead 2 women or 2 men. What we see is that even in those couples, there is, to a lesser extent, but still it's there, these couples also engage in a household division of labor. So my question in this paper is, how do the legal institutions facing these couples affect that division of labor? So I look at how changes to laws around the right for the couple to file their taxes jointly, the right for the couple to file alimony upon dissolution of the couple, the right for the couple to adopt a child, the right for the couple to have spousal health insurance coverage, and the right of the couple to get married. How these different institutions, legal institutions, financial institutions, social institutions, how the changes to the access for these couples to those rights change the internal division of labor. So is this feminist economics? On the one hand, you could say, yes, it looks at same-sex couples, so an underrepresented population, one that's understudied in economics. That's good. It looks at the household division of labor, so recognizing unpaid work as work and as an important economic activity. Yes, the paper looks at the importance of legal institutions, of social norms, for example, around marriage, along with economic institutions like filing taxes jointly, right? So it brings in a lot of different information. That's feminist economics. But methodologically, I'm using survey data. I'm basically doing a difference in differences analysis on survey data that only captures same-sex couples in the United States where one person in the couple claimed themselves on the survey, I'm using American Community Survey data, where one person claimed themselves as the householder. So that means I don't capture any couples that live with their parents, for example, or who live in group homes, anything like that, right? So it's a limited sample. So is this feminist economics? I'm a feminist. Is feminist economics any work that's being done by a feminist? I don't think so. I have certainly written many papers that I think aren't reflections of feminist economics. So I don't think that that's the criterion. You know, this paper, I'm working to get it published in a mainstream journal. So, you know, is that feminist economics where the paper is published? Can feminist economics be published in mainstream journals? These are open questions. I tend to think that this paper is an example of feminist economics because I'm bringing in the institutional context. And in particular, the thing that makes this paper feminist economics for me is the way that I interpret the results, the way I situate the results in a broader context of economics literature, but also feminist theory and feminist history, and trying to understand how households make decisions. So it's a lot about processes and how institutions affect everyday economic realities. So for me, it's an example of feminist economics, but others might disagree. In that sense, to conclude, I just want to make the point that in some ways, even though it's just me talking at you in this video, I tried to make this video in some ways an example of feminist economics. I tried to leave a lot of things open-ended. As I said in the very beginning, there's no conclusive or definitive definition of what feminist economics is. And so I tried to reflect that in these discussions. I hope you found this video informative, that you can walk away from it with a better understanding of what feminist economics is. I hope also that it has piqued your interest in feminist economics. Maybe you want to check out another video in this series on gender relations and economics. I hope that you find them informative.